so I'm very brief on my introductions.
My hope this morning is that
welcome Dr.
if
Tom
we do nothing else, that you can begin the process of letting go of some of those beliefs that you've held so near and dear for so long that you're not even aware why you believe them anymore, and that you can begin to look at this whole process a little bit differently. This morning, I would expect to be talking for about an hour and reserve somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes at the end for you to be able to ask me questions. I'm fortunate in that I have a number of my colleagues who are with me this morning that may be able to help add further insight. The only problem is that they went howling at the Full Moon Saloon last night, and only half of them still have their voice, so we'll have to try and deal with that. But with that, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background on who we are, where we fit into the General Motors scheme, so that you can get some... Why does it get louder when I come over here? Scaring myself. General Motors Powertrain Division, it says was formed in 1990 and 1991. That is a reflection of the perpetual whitewater rafting that we're going through right now, of constant reorganization and change. When I began working with Dr. Deming and working with People Systems, we were a division that was much smaller than what you see up here. We had approximately 13,000 employees. Of that 13,000 employees, about 1,000 were being affected by the systems that we were designing, the balance being represented employees. So that's indication number one. I'm going to be talking about systems that affect non-represented employees. That'll be the scope of what we're talking about. Over the course of 1990 and 91, we went through 3 major reorganizations with the intent of bringing together those subunits within General Motors that had anything to do with the design or manufacture of powertrain systems. And as that happened, our scope began to increase. So we now have somewhere around 67,000 employees, approximately 9,000 of which are affected by what I'll be sharing with you this morning. Because of that, as you can imagine, our energy has been focused more on getting the 9,000 people comfortable with the direction we're going. What I'll share with you, as I know you realize, is a dramatic departure from normal approaches to people systems. And you know that you can't just impose that on people. There's a process of helping them understand so that they can recommit to the direction that we're going, and it doesn't happen quickly. Because of that, that's where we've been focusing our energy. It's less on new development and more on how do you prepare people to get comfortable with and on board with the kind of changes that we'll be talking about. So keep that in mind, as scope is fairly significant. I'd hope you also understand that we are a small system within a larger system, so those of you who are struggling with trying to deal with requirements from either government that are imposed on you or a larger corporation that you need to deal with, your situation is very similar to ours, and hopefully you'll see some places where you can find a path for your own growth and development. Today's presentation is intended to help explore the relationship of Dr. Deming's teachings to people systems, which, as was mentioned in the introduction, is probably the most controversial and least comfortable application of anything that he has to say. We'll be talking about trying to understand systems and taking a systems view of looking at people and what the interdependencies are and the components that affect what you might observe as performance or contribution. And then we'll talk about knowledge of variation and what that means and some of the principles of common cause and special cause as it relates to people. We'd like then, once we kind of walk that bridge from what you know about what Dr. Deming has to say and apply it to people systems, we'd like to share with you what we've done in the world of compensation, because if it's not the right answer for you, it at least gives you a very clear picture of if you don't do what you're currently doing, what might you do? After we've done that, we'd like to share a framework for feedback systems. We are, in a sense, sharing with you work that's in progress, because what I have is at concept stage that we'll share for feedback. It's not a finished product. but I know that it at least gives you a glimpse of how different we're looking at feedback than at least we have in the past from a formal feedback setting. It does beg the question, at least in our research, of whether formal, and I underscore formal as in annual, predetermined time, sit down and have feedback, whether that ever really can accomplish its intended purpose. And then last, I'd like to just leave you with a quick thought on organizational readiness for change. Often when we come and talk to groups of people like you, one of the most difficult things for you to deal with is that you're already there, but you're having a real difficult time working with your organization in getting them to the point of being willing to take that next step. So what might be the indicators that you would look for to assess whether or not your organization is ready to move in the direction that we're talking about? By the way, I know I mentioned that I'd take questions at the end, but if you absolutely can't contain yourself, there is a microphone right over here, and I'd be glad to try and field that as I go through this presentation. Just a quick refresher around Deming's core theory, and specifically the system of profound knowledge. What I hope to touch on in personnel terms is going to be appreciation for a system, and by that I mean viewing work as a very dynamic process. So how does that fit into what you observe as performance? Theory of variation in the context of our ability to gain a statistical understanding of how work is done. Theory of knowledge, which points to our ability to predict based on a theory. And then knowledge of psychology. And on this subject, when we talk about psychology, we'll really be honing in specifically on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, as well as issues around self-esteem, which have a very important implication when we're talking about rating and ranking. As we start, I'd like to at least provide a model or a framework for looking at people systems. This is our puzzle wheel, and intentionally it's a puzzle because all of the systems that you see here that are traditionally defined as personnel systems or people systems are very much interconnected. It's extremely difficult to change a reward system and not immediately have a direct impact on a feedback system. And maybe in the world of order, those of you who currently have a feedback system with ratings and use those ratings to drive other systems, it probably is somewhat overwhelming to think about eliminating ratings in your feedback system because you're very well aware of everything else that's going to be impacted as soon as you do that. Immediately, you'll have to address rewards, and soon on the heels of that, you're going to have to talk about selection and promotion. So it's really preparing yourself to change almost every system or process that you have that affects people. In many organizations, what's holding all of those systems together is not organizational values and beliefs. Unfortunately, it's the values and beliefs of a given leader or leadership group that are never clearly understood or questioned or articulated. And so as leadership changes, so change the organizational values and beliefs. And that begins to affect every system that you have. How often can you relate to the issue of a new president coming in or whoever is going to lead your organization, and the energy and effort that's expended on trying to find out what this person's all about, what they like, what they don't like. People scurry around and try and reassess themselves to align with what they think that new direction will be. What we would hope is that more organizations begin to stabilize their values and beliefs, and that one of the qualifiers for leaders coming in is that they can live with the constancy of purpose that's been established within that organization, which would certainly eliminate a lot of the confusion that people have and allow you to have systems that are compatible with your stated values and beliefs. Now for us, our values and beliefs are very much founded on what we've learned from Dr. Deming, and so what you'll see are the beginnings of systems that start to support that. I'll share with you reward systems, but as I said before, we are jumping right over here now and having to redo how we approach feedback. when you think about whether or not you should have ratings or rank people, it might be helpful to think of that as a two-part question, because the answers to these questions could be very different, and how you look at them could be very different. The first question has to do with our ability to fairly rate or rank people. And I'd at least like to pose some questions around that to have you do some self-assessment about how capable we are of doing that. The second question has to do with, even if you can accurately and fairly assess performance, the second question has to do whether it's worth it to you. Are the gains that you're trying to achieve enough to offset the downside associated with rating and ranking people? Let's start with the first question, which has to do with our ability, and at least propose some concerns. And probably the most obvious thing that we'll say today is that performance evaluations, unfortunately, are done by evaluators. We haven't found a way to do that differently. Associated with that fact are a number of concerns. The first has to do with whether or not we are consistent from evaluator to evaluator in terms of our leniency with ratings, or in terms of how strict we are. If you think of yourselves looking at data in your own organization over time, you might ask yourself how much energy you have expended trying to address this first issue of having consistent approach to evaluation. When you see rating distributions different perhaps from manager to manager or function to function, tremendous amount of effort is expended trying to address this issue. The second point has to do with whether or not we rate according to the Pygmalion effect. There's a couple ways to look at that, but probably the most dominant thought that we would consider has to do with seeing people a certain way, making a decision either based on reputation or a quick observation, and forming an impression about someone. Once that impression is formed, one of the things that we've learned is that we do an awful lot to seek out data to validate our already preconceived notion about someone. And it's extremely difficult to break away. You immediately tend to observe those things that validate what you believe. You tend to filter out those things or not see the things that are inconsistent with what you know about someone. That's extremely important when you think about fairness and accuracy of what we observe as performance. In other words, your reputation often precedes you, and that can be good or it can be bad. Do we tend to favor those who are like us, either in terms of race or sex or culture or age or interest? Again, there is a lot of data that would indicate that that's an issue for us. One of my favorite exercises that we went through as a group had to do with trying to understand diversity in the workforce. And in that exercise, we were broken into small groups. And in small groups, we're given labels or categories of people and asked to immediately chart pad perceptions we had about that particular category of person. And let me give you an example and ask you to think about this for just a second. One of the categories that we were asked to just jot some thoughts down was white males that were over 50 years old in the workforce. Just think about that for just a second. My guess, and I wish we could do it a little more interactively, but it's difficult in a group this size, is that some of the things that came to mind have to do with people who are set in their ways, people who might be adverse to technology, people who are coasting. I'm not saying any of that to offend anyone in the room, but the fact is I am convinced that those are the kind of thoughts that probably went through your mind. At least they did in our little group. We did the same thing for new college graduates. What comes to mind? Single mothers with young children. What's uncanny is how very quickly each of us could articulate our stereotypes, and they were consistent with one another. If that's true, then at least you might ask yourself the question, how good are we at leaving that behind, overcoming that as we look at people in the workforce? Is the rating influenced by the rater's position among a group of raters. We were able to find a little graphic to try and highlight what the issue is here. You have a group of people, minus a leader, talking. A little bit of controversy in there. The leader appears. And the answer is clear. Those of you who might work in the human resources function or have tried to do anything around team appraisals, you may have been in work teams where one of the ways to try and overcome individual managerial biases is to have a group of leaders come together and have a team process for evaluating people. Unfortunately, all that does is introduce yet another bias to try and deal with, and that has to do with the ability of a person to influence a group. And if the leader speaks, chances are consensus will be reached far more quickly, or a powerful person. Or the other thing that can happen is trade-offs are made. You accommodate someone in hopes that when your time is in the barrel that you get some kind of support with whatever issue you're trying to address. So it introduces a whole different level of dynamics that are also problematic. Do the raters use the same criteria, and do they weight them the same? Most organizations work hard to try and define consistent criteria. What you cannot control is the weighting factor, because I'm not sure it's done on a conscious level. And the example that I would use is maybe we've got criteria like teamwork and leadership and technical ability, just to name a few. And we agree we're going to weight them equally. The problem with that is there are some things that I value, and I tend to pay more attention to those things. In my case, I tend to value people who can complement me, who can make up for the things that I don't have, because I see that as my own shortfall, and it's important to me that I have someone on my team who can offset that. Other people may tend to weight heavier those skills or attributes that are similar to their own. Obviously, if you're good at it, it must be important. You weight it heavier and when you observe it in other people. So again, we introduce an issue of a variation, at least, in how we view performance. I would hope that at a minimum, that some of the things we've just touched on very briefly at least shed light on the fact that it's a very difficult multivariable problem. It is not a simple process. Another systems kind of look at what you observe as performance is something that Peter Schultes shared in a forum like this, probably about 4 years ago now, but he took this concept of a systems view of performance and laid it out almost in a mathematical equation. Let's assume, and I think this is fairly safe to assume, that there is something that you observe as performance. You know what level of scrap you have. You know how many engineering changes are required or that have occurred. There's something known that you can measure and observe. The question you're trying to answer is how much of that is related to other factors, how much of it's related to the personal contribution of an individual. These are just some examples of factors, but Peter pointed out issues like the native ability and early education of an individual, which really points to the talent or IQ that someone might bring to a job. The second factor having to do with the worker's individual effort and personal contribution, and this is the area where you think that the individual has the most control over that factor. In fact, the research would indicate that the environment that a person is working within has far more to do with controlling their ability to expend effort than the person themselves. In a good working environment, people will naturally expend a great deal of effort. In an environment where they can't do that, it's oppressive, or they feel at risk to be able to do that, that far more controls what an individual is able to contribute. And yet this is the thing that we think by rating and ranking we can motivate people to push up or push down. Training and orientation that's given to an employee. One question about that might be, do people who have higher ratings typically, are they typically the benefactors of training? I mean, do you tend to focus more quality training on people who have higher ratings, which becomes a self-fulfilling then kind of prophecy? The variability and capability of the processes and systems within which the employee works. That has to do with the materials, the machines, the methods that are employed, things like that. The system of evaluation itself, the possible inconsistencies that we've already pointed to a little bit earlier. All of these being factors in what you're attempting to observe as performance. What Peter indicated is that we learned probably in about second grade, when you know what the value of X is, but you don't know the value of any of those other factors, it's not possible to solve for B, which is what we do each time we try and rate or rank people. Another possible concern. We might call these carryover effects. And that has to do with the fact that actions that people take sometimes take time to show up in results. And we're living in a time when people are moving very rapidly through organizations, at least through most organizations. So that person A takes some action, and to the extent that there's a time lag and people shift or move, the results may not appear until the next person's on the job. Now, in our world, in the General Motors world, there's lots of examples of that. Probably the one that people who read about General Motors at all could most identify with would be when Roger Smith was president of General Motors. Clearly, some of the things that Roger Smith did were unprecedented in General Motors history. And probably it's too soon even yet to determine the full impact of some of the things that were done. But today, Bob Stempel is president of General Motors. Who will be held accountable when those results appear? We're still on that first question, but in summary, you might think of these as issues around rating or ranking people. That if you're going to do that, if you continue on with a practice like that, then you've got to assume the following things. That personal effort and contribution can be correctly separated from the effects of the system. That training and coaching and leadership are adequate and consistent from individual to individual. That the effects of system barriers can be separated from the actions of being taken by the person that's being rated. And that carryover effects that we just talked about can be separated from the effects of the person being rated. And that the evaluator effects can also be correctly separated from the personal effort and contribution. Or there are no evaluator effects. Somehow you've been able to find a way to overcome all the biases and concerns that we've raised. The question that you should be asking yourselves is, do these assumptions hold true? Now, there are some who, in spite of that, would continue to say, I can understand other companies, other managers have problems, but I'm very good at this, and I can discern contribution among people. I don't have that problem. For those of you that fall in that category, I'd ask you to give serious consideration to the second question. And as we do that, we'll share with you some pretty gut-wrenching experiences that we went through in General Motors. Does the value of doing so outweigh the potential negatives? Is it worth it? As you consider whether or not it's worth it, there are at least 4 areas of consideration. The first has to do with the impact on self-esteem. The second has to do with motivation. The third has to do with cooperation. And then the last is something that we would call an opportunity cost of ratings, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail. Around the issue of self-esteem, let's assume for a minute that we're able to accurately and fairly assess contribution, and that the performance of people falls along some kind of normal bell-shaped curve as a starting point, that's a known fact. And think of this as a rating scale that goes from 1 to being high, the high end of the scale, to 6 being at the low end of the scale. We believe, and have had the fortune to validate this theory over and over and over again, that most people think they're pretty good. There's some research that was done by Sun Oil Company that indicated that 80% of the people believe that they're in the top 30% of contributors. Mathematically, that's not possible, but 80% of the people think that they're in the top 30% of contributors. Now, we've had, as I said, an opportunity to test that theory in forums like this. And unfortunately, it's not true. What is true is that 90% of the people think that they're in the top 10% of contributors. When you think of yourself in relation to other people you know. Now, for a long time, those of us in the personnel world who had responsibility for administering feedback systems with ratings used to beat managers over the head for not addressing the issue of using the full distribution scale that they had at their disposal, telling you that you're not doing your job. Perhaps you were doing exactly what you knew intuitively to be right, because if 90% of the people think they're in the top 30% of contributors, you probably said to yourself, what value is there in it for me in trying to get productivity out of my department by telling people they're not as good as they think they are? What am I going to gain from that? And so chances are, when you're wavering between a higher rating or a lower rating, 9 times out of 10 you're going to go to the higher end in some sort of recognition of the impact that it would have on that individual, and consequently the impact it would have on you and your team. We also believe there's a second theory here around self-esteem. And hard as it might be to believe this, not only do we think we're pretty good, we actually think we get better every year. We keep learning, we keep growing, we keep improving. And so this is now year 2. And if you had someone working for you, you rated them a little bit on this 6-point scale. Let's say you rated them in the middle. And throughout the year, the person that you rated in the middle expended a tremendous amount of effort. There was smoke coming out of their office. They worked so hard, trying to address the things that you pointed out. Nothing has changed in terms of the output, but the effort was tremendous. What are you going to do year 2? Year 2, you're probably going to shift the rating up, not because anything's changed in terms of the contribution you observed, but because the effort was such that it was the thing that you felt was the right thing to do, to acknowledge. We believe then that without a forced distribution, over time, your rating distribution will always skew to the high end in acknowledgement of those things. We probably have 50 or 60 years worth of history to validate that, with constant tampering of introducing a 4-point system. It skews, so you interject a new anchor in there, and now you got a 5-point system to a 6-point system back to a 5. We kept playing with the number of ratings that we had, trying to address this issue, when in fact it's going to continue to happen for reasons that we weren't paying attention to. Now, we still, for all those years, continued to do this silly process of rating people, primarily because we felt it important to tie a rating to pay and to other rewards. And the question we had to deal with as we look at this whole thing in a new light is whether or not money really is a motivator. Is money a motivator? And one of the things that we discovered as we began to examine that issue is that, yeah, money is a motivator for some people. And it's for those people who might be at the bottom in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with from probably about 8th grade. For those people who are at the bottom of that triangle that are struggling to survive, maybe someone that's gone through a divorce and you're trying to just stay on a level playing field, money can be a significant motivator. But for those people who have passed that point, there are other things that are far more motivating for people than just money. But in organizations, the only thing we know how to do to express appreciation to someone is through money. We haven't figured out some of the other things that have a very significant impact on what we're trying to do, which is encourage, what I would say what we really should be trying to do, encourage intrinsic motivation to flourish. Just to validate that, and if you go back and look at your own organization, my sense is it's not going to look much different than this. This is a survey that was done of U.S. employees looking at factors that they considered most important in a work environment. It has a direct correlation if you look at attrition data that you might have and why people leave. If your organization is like ours, money is not going to be the primary reason that people leave. In fact, on this list, issues around money drop down to about number 7. The things that are far more important to employees are also the things that are more difficult for us to deal with. They have to do with recognition. They have to do with personal choice and freedom, involvement at work, things that make people feel challenged. So in spite of the fact that we continue to hold on to this issue around money, there are other things that if we could let go of that, we could be putting our energy into. And in a sense, I would hope you've all seen this from Dr. Deming's book. I believe that's what he's talking about. To the extent that we can't let go of things like money as the only vehicle for recognizing people, we're missing a tremendous opportunity to begin to look at what is it that helps people get excited at work, and how can we instill that? How can we take advantage of it? The issue, you'll remember, I raised at the beginning of looking at whether or not it's worth it. I talked about the opportunity cost of ratings. And that it comes in at least 2 flavors. You may be able to think of more. But minimally, one of the things that happens to the extent we continue to hang on to performance ratings, this is kind of a byproduct of that, is that it encourages a habit of superficial search for causes. What that means is that our whole approach to problem solving has a tendency to stop once we have found the culprit. Once we have found who is responsible for something that's gone wrong, we've satisfied our search for fixing the problem, as opposed to taking a more systemic look at problem solving and continuing to ask why, to get deeper into the system, look at more data to understand what the root cause is and to be able to fix it. The second issue, and to me this is maybe more personally felt because it was a revelation, at least to me, when I realized I think I've crossed over some line, has to do with how we view people in this effort to try and rate and rank people. I don't know about you, but I used to spend a tremendous amount of effort trying to, on a daily basis, make sure that I had a good sense of who was best, who was next best, and who was last, and constantly going through that kind of sorting process in my mind. Because that's what I was being asked to do. I thought it was important. And part of that process is you spend a lot of energy constantly looking for, trying to validate those perceptions about people. The other thing that we do is we're on this perpetual search of looking for perfection from people. Think of your own feedback system and what you are rating people on. It assumes that you're going to be good at everything, or at least it asks people to be good at everything. Can you imagine the power of letting go of that and appreciating the differences that people bring? And instead of asking everyone to be perfect, you focus your energy as a leader understanding the very different strengths that people bring and taking advantage of that. To the extent that you do that, it starts to impact selections. It starts to impact how you build teams. It allows people to do what they do well naturally anyway. But it takes a lot of energy to look at it differently, and it's almost not possible to do that until you let go of the energy that you're currently expending on rating and ranking people. In the last few minutes, I've tried to touch on a number of issues around whether or not it's worth it to rate or rank people. What I'd like to do now, I'm hoping that you at least walked away with some sense of some of the impact on motivation, some issues around self-esteem, cooperation, and then the opportunity cost of ratings. What I'd like to do is now walk over into, if all of that's true, and you're ready to let go of what you've done in the past, how might you compensate people in a world that's based around some of the things you're learning from Dr. Deming? Let me start by giving you Powertrain's compensation objectives. They're worded a little bit differently. Some of the words are very consistent with what you know, but there's some significant deviations from what you know. Attract, retain, and not demotivate people. As opposed to motivate people, we're letting go of this notion that pay is the motivator. And what we're saying instead is pay can be a very significant demotivator. And I'd ask you to think for a minute, personalize this. The best increase, the most significant increase you ever received, I want you to think about how long that good feeling stayed with you. And most people would talk about somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 weeks, where you really felt good about that increase. And then sooner or later, that begins to drift away. Now, I'd also like you to think about the time where you got less than what you thought you rightfully deserved, and how long that stayed with you. Most people, again, would say that that feeling stayed with them until the next cycle. So what that's saying is, whatever is designed here, we need to understand what is it that causes people to feel demotivated. And obviously that's going to be around issues of equity and fairness that we'll try and talk about. We also wanted to reduce unexplainable variation in pay, and I'll show you what we were trying to deal with. And at least, maybe encourage is too strong a word, but allow cooperation to exist rather than internal competition. That was our aim. In words, our intent was to design a pay system, and I'll show you this with pictures, so hopefully it'll be a lot more clear, that annual base pay increases would be determined by where someone was currently positioned in their pay range and how long they had been there. Now, this is a stopping point again. I need to tell you that what I'm going to share with you is inside of a framework where external market surveys have been conducted, where pay ranges have been constructed, where there's midpoints and maximums and all of those things that help to make sure that you're lined up with wherever you're targeting yourself in the outside market. That's already set up for us in the General Motors system, and our job then is to determine when we have a funding level to award increases, how are we going to do that? So this gives you the words around how we do that. Distinctions based on contribution are going to be limited to those who are truly exceptional. And I'll share with you in just a second what exceptional means to us. And then that would spend 90% of our fund for the year for increases. We'll reserve 10%, and we'll use those for what we would call non-contribution distinctions, and I'll share with you what that means. In terms of an exceptional employee, this is the definition that we use to try and get a common understanding of what we meant by that. And I would hope that this sort of rings consistent with what Dr. Deming would call inside or outside of the system. An exceptional employee has inarguably stood out from the rest of the work team for a sustained period of time in contribution as evidenced by commitment to organizational beliefs and values and system optimization. is easily declared so by those that know him or her. It's consensus by acclamation. There is no debate. Exceptional, given its most elementary definition, is rare. To identify more than a very few individuals as such negates the exceptional label and makes it a non-tolerable contradiction. It is more likely that a given work team would have none rather than one exceptional team member. If that's what we mean by exceptional contribution, there really are only three possible ways where contribution can be identified. One is through free expression, and that means an individual manager by themselves determining who's exceptional given that definition. With all the data that we have over the years, we don't believe that that's possible to do. We did try to pilot, even with that definition, allowing managers to free express who's exceptional. 25% of the people in that kind of process were exceptional. Well, that's not going to work. We can control it using numerical targets and limits. And we have tried to do that in General Motors in the past. But the problem with that is that, as you probably know, it fixes an arbitrary point. And if you determine that you're going to have 5 or 10% of your people as exceptional, you will have 5 or 10% of your people as exceptional whether they are or not. And the last is to have a very clearly defined process that involves people who would know the individuals in question in the process of determining who's exceptional. I won't go through the detail of how we've done that, but obviously that's the path that we chose. I'd share with you the results that in the time when we were doing this process of identifying exceptional contributors, out of the 1,300 people that we had, only 5 people were identified as exceptional. And that continues to be true in the 3 years that we've gone through this process. So clearly there's some very tight controls on it in terms of how we go through that process. Once that has taken place, you've now made the determination of people who are outside the system, either on the high end, in the way that I've just described, but that's also true on the low end. There may be people who are simply, they don't fit, they're not contributing, and there's a problem, and that has to be dealt with in a separate system. Now we're ready to talk about, for most people, how pay is going to work. And the concept is very simple. We have really built our theory around a maturity curve concept, which is very familiar in particular to technical people, which comprise the majority of our population in powertrain. And clearly the theory is that there's some correlation between experience and pay. And that earlier in time, the acceleration of increase is greater than it is over time. And you might think of that throughout your own career. Probably in the first 5 years of your career, the rate of growth is certainly greater than it tends to be in the last 5 years of your career. They're at some point where it does begin to level off. That's a fairly acceptable concept to people. So back to the issue of what's perceived to be fair and equitable, that's the reason that we pulled from a maturity curve concept. We've simply taken that concept now and laid it over our pay range structure. So think of this as a classification that's familiar to you, but for talking purposes, let's say this is a project engineer. And the midpoint is what we in General Motors would determine to be the competitive level of pay. That's how we've defined it. The maximum is the most that we're willing to pay a project engineer. The maturity curve concept simply takes most people, the people who are not outside the system, in other words, the people inside the system, and it progresses them through the pay range at a more rapid rate until they hit the midpoint, and then they begin to level off somewhere halfway between the midpoint and the salary maximum. Those people who are considered to be exceptional would simply move faster and wouldn't cap out until they reached the salary maximum, which is the most that we'd be willing to pay for that skill level. If that's the concept, I don't think you have this, but this is what we started with. This is just a scatter plot to give you a sense of the kind of dispersion that existed when we started, before we started this whole plan. Now you can see from a distance that there is some pattern, that if you look real hard, you do see some relationship between time and pay. If you look very carefully, you'll see that there's a great deal of variation around that. In fact, there are people that entered this pay range that were about $1,000 a month apart, you know, if you looked at the broadest span. And that would have felt good if we could have explained it. What I would have liked to have been able to say after coming off of years and years of performance pay is that that was the dominant driver of the variation that you see. Unfortunately, that had very little to do with the variation that you see in pay. The most significant factor in the variation that you see had to do with where someone started their employment with General Motors. Now, we were able to look at that because one of the advantages of all of these consolidations is that many different histories start coming together. And what we were observing here is the history of Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac coming together. And so where you started was the most significant factor. Now, that would be okay if where you started and the variation you see in pay was because of cost of living. Again, we could explain that. Unfortunately, that didn't have anything to do with it. The factor that had the most to do with it is that Cadillac was the place to work. And it was also in of the cities that those divisions are located in. It was in the highest cost of living area, but it was Cadillac. You didn't have to pay a lot to hire someone in a Cadillac because people wanted to work there. On the other hand, Buick in Flint, Michigan, you had to pay big dollars to get people to be willing to come to Flint, particularly right out of school. It wasn't exactly the mecca for young singles. So you start off at a different level of pay. And then each year, as increases are awarded, they're awarded as a percentage of your base pay. And so the divergence started. And what you see there is a reflection of that. Now imagine having to tell the people in your workforce that that's what's driving the difference in pay. It's not a comfortable position to be in. The concept then, in terms of how we drive increases, simply takes that scatter plot data, if you will, and begins to converge people along a maturity curve inside of the pay range. It's as simple as that. Now, I think you have some more slides in there about how that might work. I'm going to skip that because I think you've got the essence of how you might look at pay differently, and I want to make sure that I hit a couple of other important points. So I'm going to go to this slide that talks about a reserve fund. You'll remember that I told you that 90% of our increase fund is spent using that maturity curve concept. The remaining 10% is held aside to address what we would call non-contribution factors. And the process by which this money is distributed is very similar to how we looked at exceptional contributors. So once again, there are going to be a lot of people involved in determining where it's appropriate to expend this money. The way this works then is that you may add money to a system-generated increase for one of these factors, assuming that there's consensus reached that that's the appropriate thing to do. Job complexity. In our world, the reason that that's a factor that we needed to introduce is that it has more to do with some problems in our classification structure. We could have two superintendents classified in the same pay range. One has assembly, one has machining. It would be readily agreed upon in our organization that being a superintendent of a machining area is far more complex than assembly because of some of the technical issues you deal with, some of the skilled trades issues. Overtime is far more regular in a machining operation than in assembly. For lots of reasons, we would agree that that difference needed to be addressed. Critical skills. In every discipline, we have some skill areas that are in high demand in the external market. In engineering, it might be finite element analysis that carries a premium dollar. And that's also not reflected in our normal pay structure. We needed to have the ability to address that in a system like this. Salary compression, that has to do with obviously the differential between a supervisor and a subordinate, making sure that that's appropriate. We needed to have the ability to address that. Position and range. You could be one of those people that is so far out of line with everyone else, and you want to accelerate bringing that person in line with everyone else, so you might want to add money to their system-generated increase. And then scope of experience and accumulated skills. Time, the issue of defining time for this concept is an issue of getting to the best common denominator you possibly can. For us, that was time in level. But there's a lot of things you could look at. You could look at time since degree. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things. You need to find the one that fits best, but even in doing that, there could be experience that you can't capture in your system before someone ever came to your company, for example, and we needed the ability to address that as well. So these were the appropriate reasons, if you will, for adding money to a system-generated increase. And again, as I mentioned, there was a very clear definition around this and process so that we could work through it and not use it as a substitute for performance, perceived performance. Okay. I'm going to index again here just a little bit to make sure I save time for questions. Come back to this wheel. And you'll remember that I said as soon as you play with one system, you've got the next one right on its heels that you need to be ready to talk about. And what I'd like to share with you is some what we think to be pretty exciting new learnings for us around this whole concept of feedback. So we've talked now about reward systems and how we've looked at that. I'm going to come over here and talk about feedback and development of people. What I'm not going to talk about, and I know you're going to ask me about, is selection. And I'm begging off of that because we simply haven't gotten to it yet. We are instead focusing on folding in all these new people into the work that we've already done. But let me talk a little about feedback. See if this feels right. Criticism, either real or implied, deals a destructive blow to an individual's ego or to their self-esteem and self-worth. And yet, external feedback is extremely critical and necessary for ongoing growth and development. So in a sense, a feedback system, whatever feedback system you design, is trying to manage those two conflicting realities. How do you deal with both of those in a way that accomplishes the aim of your system? Some new learnings for us. First of all, I would say that the aim of our system, the aim of our feedback system, is to help people grow and develop. That's the aim. So we've got some new learnings that really call to question how we went about trying to do that in the past. Let me start by giving you, this is kind of like the second generation of feedback systems. So before I get into that, I just want to share that the first generation of feedback systems for us was the system where we eliminated ratings. We stopped doing that. We designed a system, in fact, it was a system I shared here 2 years ago, where we had peer and subordinate input folded into the process, and peers and subordinates were selected by the person who was receiving the feedback. We eliminated much of the administrative burden tied to the feedback system, really focused on what are the strengths and significant things that this person should keep doing, what are the opportunities for improvement. So it was strictly focused only on development and used for nothing else. And we felt very good about that. The surveys that we had done around that system gave us very positive feedback. And that the surveys from both managers and employees indicated that it was a far improved system for purposes of development. And the feature that we were most fearful of, which was the feature of input from peers and subordinates, ended up being the feature that people valued the most. But over time, the system was being used less and less frequently, if you looked at that in terms of measuring it by the annual date that feedback was to be given. So here we were getting feedback that the system works great, but it's not being used. So that's telling us something. And we began to examine what is this aversion that we have to formal feedback systems. And that took us on this new path of learning that I'd like to share with you. Some of these are learnings from the old system, and some of them are new learnings that we're developing. The first learning is that supervisors, because of the rapid change that we're going through and because of the wide spans of control, supervisors can no longer be the exclusive source of feedback. And yet in many places we still expect, and employees still expect, that that supervisor is knowledgeable enough to be able to give you the kind of feedback that you need. But the reality is that, at least in our company, from a geography standpoint, people are spread all over the place. And in some parts, I mean, it's very rare that you see your supervisor more than once every 2 weeks. Technical ability, again, that has to do with the broad span of control. You may not be working for someone who has the same kind of technical knowledge and ability that you do. So is it fair to expect that person to be as knowledgeable as you'd like them to be, to give you, or at least that we have expected them to be in the past? Or is their role in fact changing? The second thing that we came to terms with is feedback does happen all the time. We don't have to assume that the only time feedback happens is when we sit down and give an annual, go through an annual discussion. It happens constantly. And it happens not only through people talking to you, but believe it or not, you give yourself feedback all the time. You know when you did something well, you know when you didn't. So there's the feedback that comes from self, there's the feedback that comes from a task when you know you did it well. The other significant thing that we're trying to come to terms with is that people's desire for feedback is variable from person to person. And yet we've continued to have a one-size-fits-all kind of process that makes everybody go through all the hoops of, here's what you're good at, here's what you're not so good at, let's talk about your career planning. Well, you know, you may not give a hoot about your career planning, depending on where you are. Or that may be the most significant thing you want to talk about. So we're trying to come to terms with allowing people to face that. Not everybody has to go through the same hoops. Another significant learning for us is if the intent of a feedback system is to change behavior in some way, to either reinforce good behavior or to change behavior that's not as desirable, that the feedback system has very little ability to move that needle. That the thing that moves the needle on changing behavior more than anything else is what we would call observational learning. It's watching what other people do and then watching the consequences of what they've done, either good or bad. And as you do that, you fold that into your repertoire of learning and it starts to affect how you behave. And then, very significant point is this idea that I tried to mention before about taking advantage of people's strengths. Instead of trying to make everybody good at everything, which is never going to happen, we expend a tremendous amount of effort trying to improve in areas that we will not be able to substantially improve. So instead of doing that, how about understanding what people's strengths are and then growing jobs to match those strengths? So it takes a different approach to how you define how work is done. Very significant learning is in the area of the psychology of feedback. This is what we really wanted to understand. Why are people avoiding formal feedback systems? And we think we're beginning to understand that, first of all, voluntary systems may be more effective. That's because there are times when we all individually feel more vulnerable than other times. And wouldn't it be great if you could choose when you're ready for the feedback? Because if you could choose it, then chances are it'll be at a time when you can accept it and deal with it a little bit better. That gets to this issue of self-esteem. Formal feedback systems in all of our minds tend to be paired with negative feedback. Over time, from the time you were a child, when somebody wants to sit down and talk to you, you know, buried in there, they're going to tell you something that you really don't want to hear. And so the night before it's time for you to sit down, whether you're on the giving or receiving end of that process, you're not looking forward to it. It's not going to be a lot of fun. We have always focused on the supervisor as the primary person in this feedback process. But there's three components to feedback. There's the person who's sending the message itself, and the person who's receiving the message. And of those three things, the most significant piece that needs to be looked at is the receiver of the message. The other two are important, but that's where we've placed all of our attention. The most important is the receiver, because that person will determine whether or not anything you have to say sinks in or it's deflected. That's where we should be concentrating our energy. Another learning is that positive feedback is received and recalled far more accurately than negative feedback, which often can be rejected or distorted because of your needs around self-esteem. If we're going to affect behavior, then feedback needs to occur at the time that something happened, not once a year. And very importantly, this has to do with this issue of the receiver being the most important person in the message or in the feedback process, is that for you as a person to hear the feedback, then where the feedback comes from is critical. You have to believe that those sources have your best interest at heart. And if you don't, you'll reject it. So if all that's true, it begins to change the whole way we've been doing this thing in the past. And what I propose to you is what I'll try and wrap up with in 2 slides here. Wow, I'm running out of time. Instead of looking at a complete focus on the individual, what we're beginning to look at is there are really 2 systems here. There's the system that is directed at the individual, but that needs to look far different than it has in the past. It needs to acknowledge some of the things we've learned on the psychology of feedback. And then there's a team development process, and that's where the power is. And that has to do with being able to look at systems and processes that teams are looking at an organization from a systems standpoint, tying into the business plan, getting customer feedback as a team, very different approach. So what we're embarking on is developing 2 different systems. A team system that might be required based on the annual business planning process, but an individual system that is not required. It's a voluntary system. And I hope you can see this, it's a little bit light. It's a voluntary system that an individual will determine when and what they want to go through. So on the individual side, its aim is to look at skill and career development. It'll be modular in format. In other words, if you don't want to talk about career planning because you're leaving in 5 years and retiring, then you don't talk about career planning. If what you want to talk about instead is maybe growing your own job or understanding how you fit in, then that's the piece that you plug into. So we've got a number of different elements here that you can pick and choose from depending on what your needs are. Again, trying to address your own tailored approach to feedback. We've got a process orientation, which is a required introduction to the whole thing. So people know what's out there, they know what's available, but that's the only required element. And all of the underpinnings to the whole process would be shared in that required orientation. We would go through a job clarification and feedback module, if you so chose to do. There would be a career assessment module. That would be the person that wants to look at where am I headed from here and how I might go about planning for that. A career partnering element. This is acknowledging that in many cases the way moves occur, the way selections are made, have a lot to do with networking and understanding people and being connected, knowing when openings occur, knowing what they're looking for, preparing yourself, acknowledging that up front and building it into the process. And then a personal development plan, and that's almost, those of you who work with a Franklin Planner process, it's almost like that. It's your own personal plan. It doesn't go to personnel. You put your plans together, you work your plans, and the training is focused on helping you put those together. I know that I've really tried to skim the surface on a lot of this stuff. Let me really close with 1 slide about change, so there's a couple minutes for questions. As you think about your own organization and you wonder, when is it ready, when can I begin to look at the world differently inside of my organization. A model that we have used fairly successfully over and over again is this process change model. There are 4 components. The first has to do with a perceived need for change. Under that category, what that means is that throughout your organization, there is an appropriate level of dissatisfaction with the current system. that's shared by many people. There's a lot of emotion and strength with that dissatisfaction, and that you've identified what it is you're embarking on, and you can agree on that. The second element has to do with having a shared vision. With leadership, commitment to what that shared vision is, involvement at all levels and very much at a leadership level, that it's clear what the vision is, people can understand it, it's concise, and it's consistent with what your stated organizational values are. If you know what your vision is, then it's far easier to lay out than what your good next steps are. You know where you are today, you know where you're headed, you determine what the appropriate next steps might be. And if you do all of those things, hopefully it's enough to overcome the natural resistance to change that you'll be facing. And the change, that resistance has to do with fear of the unknown and all the defense mechanisms that we all have when change is upon us. The point of this model is that if any one, it is a mathematical equation, that if any one of these things is absent, you'll not have enough to overcome the resistance to change. All of them are critical. So if you can think about change in that framework, I believe in your packet I gave you a copy of a completed model where we looked at our feedback system and give you just a hint of some of the things that we explored as we looked at trying to make some fairly dramatic changes in how we look at people. I realize I blew through the last part of that. I did want to leave time for questions. So if at this time there's anybody who would like to walk to the mic, I'd be glad to talk with you.
Mary?
Yes.
Excellent talk, thank you. On base pay, I guess personally I agree with where powertrain's going. The resistance that we're running into at my company is that appears to be socialism or communism on base pay, in that everybody will be paid the same depending upon years of service. I was wondering, how did you overcome that resistance at GM?
The most critical element to overcoming that is not to lead the change process with how you pay people, but that naturally follows an understanding of the message around Deming, because this fear of communism has far more to do with not understanding the basic message, not understanding looking at work from a system standpoint, and all the things that were on the front end of that presentation. For us, when we implemented our pay system, it was the logical next step. Our workforce was questioning what we were doing in the past, because they had gotten to a point where they understood some of the basic principles that we were teaching through Deming seminars and so on. The only other thing I'd say is that this is not everybody being paid the same either, and in your communications, it's probably important to highlight the fact that you're not paying everybody the same. There are differences based on classification that have to do with external market value. There's a maturity curve in there. There's a number of variables in there that do differentiate pay. It simply doesn't differentiate pay based on contribution.
Okay, thank you.
Mary, frontline supervisors, did you do any specific things to help them through the change process? In our company, we're finding frontline supervisors are having the greatest difficulty, and we've dropped ratings about a year ago, but they're struggling.
I also don't want to communicate that this just slid through for us. We did and do continue to struggle through probably some of the same things that you're raising. In terms of our implementation process, we had this presentation that you see is very similar to what all of our employees went through, all of our managers, all of our leaders. We had what I would call a cascading approach to this whole message, where we took our leaders off-site for 2 days on the subject of pay systems. If you can imagine, in our history, that would have been unheard of. So I guess one of the success factors, to try and answer part of your question, is that we paid as much attention to the implementation process and the education process as we did to the design. And it's real easy once you get a plan to ready to just blow that across your organization. If you do that, it won't work. So I guess I'd have a very well thought out plan around education and around helping people who are expected to help their employees understand all of this. Yes?
Mary, is there some thinking regarding CQI and how it applies to group incentive systems such as revenue sharing?
Can you ask that again? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Is there some thinking in CQI terms, continuous quality improvement terms, or Dr. Deming's principles, as it relates to group incentive systems such as revenue sharing or, gain sharing or impro share?
Yeah.
Can you point me to some direction?
Yeah, I would say that if you happen to be from a small company where you can get your arms around your ability to influence what kind of revenue you bring in, what I've learned from him is that what you don't want to do is break your organization apart. And in an organization like ours, where we're so large, that's what you'd have to do. But gain sharing and revenue sharing to the extent that that can apply to your total organization. So you're not dividing people up and pitting teams against one another, which is the same thing as individuals, then you'd be okay. So for large companies, I think it's extremely difficult. Small companies, you can do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me interrupt just a second here. There are more questions to go, and we will continue. I would like to release the main body in case you would like to leave for your refreshment break. The next talk is not until 9:30, so you do have still some time. If you leave, please leave quietly so we can continue the questions in process. Thanks.